Would you turn in your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11, going back to the chapter on faith? We'll look at the faith of Moses. Moses is given a lot of time because he's one of the key leaders in the nation of Israel, and one who did live by faith. We'll pick up in verse 23 and read through 28. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as a son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. And by faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. I'd like to begin this morning with some clarification. Monday was a difficult day. It's a difficult day for any preacher. You analyze your sermon to death and how you should have said what you said, but you didn't. But I used an illustration last Sunday, just one as out of many, where you and I are forced to make ethical decisions and so forth. And I just didn't qualify myself, and I probably should. And a number of people came up to me and had their comments to make, and I appreciate that. So I'm sure there's probably a lot more. And then what I'm going to do is, in going back to this illustration, I'm going to kind of weave it in as to an introduction here, and how we approach not just this issue, but all moral issues by faith. The illustration was that we found out my brother had recently been married to his male friend. And we found out on Facebook and that we were not invited. So the question, do you go or not, didn't even have to be made. But many people are asking this question. I'm not just doing this for clarification. There's hardly a family anymore that isn't touched by this in one way or another. So what would God have us do? So I'll take a little bit of time to address the subject, blended into the sermon, as an illustration of how to live in difficult situations by faith. It might clear the air, and I think it will, as I said, help other families. One thing you should know about Alice and our approach to our brother is we have never disassociated ourselves from him. We've always loved him, always loved him. And that goes for everybody else that we know of that persuasion. We have never disassociated with them. It's, hard to get down there, but since my mother died, I don't get there. We have to go to Germany and other places of the globe, I guess, just to see our children. That becomes priority. But when we have been down there, we've always gone to their home, slept over, hung out with them, okay? Those kinds of things. Oddly enough, we think we're probably being disassociated from. But I'm not going to go there. We have never discussed the subject. My brother was grown up in a Christian home, the same home that I was grown up in. He professed Christ or professed faith in Jesus as his Savior, and we just know what each other believes, and there's no need for me to try and remind them and be the heavy. The point was, when do you take a stand? We talked about Joseph of Arimathea, how kind of cowardly for a while, but then when it came the day to get Jesus' body, he boldly went to Pilate and stood out amongst his peers and so forth. And so one illustration I used was just the subject of when do you go? And I left it open-ended, that is, if there is a same-sex marriage, when do you go? What do you do? And, if you think that answer is easy, well, it isn't. Let me explain. And by the way, I think instances can change too, just depending on where you're at. But there was an article not long ago written in Christianity Today on do you go to same-sex marriages? And by the way, this is just an illustration of all moral decisions, so that's not what we're going to be talking about today. And there were 3 responses written. One is go, one is don't go, and the other one is go and send a letter or a card or, a gift. And if it's that easy, then why are there at least 3 views? Okay? There's 3 views. When it comes to morals and ethics, Christians can be some of the most conflicted people in the world because we are in conflict, aren't we, with our times and the world and so forth. But most conflicted on the inside because of a number of things that are going on. And let me explain that. We have 2 platforms that we stand on. One is love, God's love. God's love goes out to all people, and truth. And they both seem pretty absolute to me, And how do you do this? How do you stand on both? Does love trump truth? Does truth trump love? How do you act in accordance with both? Do we compromise at times one for the other? Or, to say it a little more negatively, do we err on the side of one versus the other just to be safe? Do we try to find something in the middle? And then there's this thing called the conscience, which is being guided by both love and truth. And do we compromise our conscience? The Apostle Paul probably does the best job of all in the book of Ephesians, pulling these 2 things together, that is love and truth. He said, speak the truth in love. How do you do that? Well, we're to be unafraid to speak the truth, but we're to do it in a very loving manner. By the way, only speak the truth when you have to. And most of the time we don't have to. We do not have to lecture people. Many times we don't say anything. We just live truth in a loving way. But here's the rub. You can be a very likable and loving Christian who walks in truth and not be liked and even written off. It's the age we live in. I remember quoting C.S. Lewis last week. He says, and it's the spirit of the age. He's writing in 1930, okay? He's writing in 1930, but it is. It's the age we live in, and it's the constant conflict in our souls between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. It just doesn't go away. By the way, we need to make decisions not on the basis of guts, because it does take guts to believe in what you believe and accept the fallout if that's what's going to happen. It's going to take more than guts. It's going to take faith to stand apart and to live in a very loving way with others and accept the consequences. We're not allowed to be closet Christians. That's probably the biggest problem that the author is addressing in this book, because they're under pressure. They're under pressure to conform to their peers and so forth, and life would be a lot less painless if we could just look like them on the outside and keep Jesus private on the inside, okay? And he's saying, no, that's not an option. We're not allowed to be closet Christians. But to do whatever it takes to be liked is not a life of faith. What does it say about Moses? That he chose to identify with the people of God, and therefore Christ. I'll explain that a little bit later. He chose to identify himself with the people of God and Christ and accept the reproach that choice brought. And this doesn't go, as I say, just for the invitation to a same-sex marriage. It has to do with many situations in life. There's a constant conflict between our souls and the world, and our ethics are going to be forever challenged. Talk to people in the work world. They're thinking about this all the time. Is this ethical or is it not? Can I do this? Can I not? We are one of the most conflicted people, but we have to stick to it by faith, because faith firstly obeys God over man. Verse 23. The faith of Moses starts with the faith of his parents, and there are two instances in Exodus where Pharaoh tried to kill the firstborn male, not the firstborn, but the male children who are being born. If you go back, the midwives were asked to kill the baby boys after they delivered them. And the midwives were women of faith, and they said, by the way, Pharaoh's plan failed, and so when they asked the midwives what's going on, they said, boy, these Israelite women, boy, they are robust. They're vigorous, and they have babies before we can even get there. Remember that? So that one failed. The second one was that they were to throw the male children being born into the Nile. And we are told that Moses' parents were not afraid to go against Pharaoh's edict. They preserved his life. They saw that he was no ordinary child or that he was beautiful. Now, I don't think that's the only idea here, because everybody's child is beautiful and brilliant, right? And if you were a loving parent, you'd do the same thing. It seems implied in those words is that they sensed that God had a plan for this man in the future. And you say, well, how? Well, there is a legend. It's not in Scripture, but not all legends are wrong. That Moses' father had received word from God. It might have been through Miriam, Moses' older sister, who was a prophetess, that God had something for Moses in the future. They hid him for 3 months. They couldn't do that anymore. They built the basket and put the basket in the bulrushes there of the Nile, and had Miriam overseeing the whole thing. And Pharaoh's daughter sees the little baby and takes Moses into her home and raises him. In application, we could go the way of civil disobedience. When do we civilly disobey and not? But I want to leave that alone. It's just another can of worms, okay? We're not going there. What really struck me was that Moses' faith began with his parents. That there's something going on here where faith is being passed on from one generation to the next. They, by faith, risked their lives to save Moses. And so these two examples shaped his faith, and one day would take him before Pharaoh, remember, when he would say, let my people go. So his faith started with their faith, and even though he was raised in a pagan home by Pharaoh's daughter, their faith had a bigger impact. So never stop praying for your children, by the way. Don't ever stop. Don't ever stop. Life isn't over yet. And then, secondly, faith makes choices that are eternal in nature. It may be that Moses sensed his calling, for one day he could no longer watch what's going on. Can you imagine being Moses? You're watching the Israelites be mistreated, and you're just unable to do anything about it. Well, one day, he couldn't take it anymore. And so he chose to be an Israelite versus an Egyptian. You remember when he impulsively killed the Egyptian? This Egyptian is abusing this fellow Israelite, so he steps in and he kills the Egyptian. And then he decided after that to step in when he saw two Israelites fighting with each other. And I think he thought they would look at him as some kind of leader and authority, and instead they said, who are you? We know what you did with that Egyptian, and he gets scared and he decides to go off to Midian. Would it have been a sin for Moses to stay in power in Egypt? Thinking of Joseph before? It would not have been a sin in one sense. In another way, it would have been. Because he could have possibly used his position as he grew in power to help his fellow man. And he could have thought of Joseph who preceded him. But there's a difference between these two characters. Joseph is living under a much nicer Pharaoh, and he is used to bring Jacob and his family down to Egypt to preserve life. Moses is under a ruthless Pharaoh, and he has to also preserve life. And if he is going to do that and fulfill maybe this calling that he senses, it would be sin to stay in the house of Pharaoh's daughter and do nothing. So that's the sin I think that it's really referring to, not all these decadent sins of the Egyptians. It would have been sin to do nothing. He simply could not watch the inhumanity going on anymore. So Moses made a choice, and that choice cost him a very cush life in Egypt. He looked, as it said, toward his reward. I'm sure he's thinking about the promise and the promised land, but I think he's moving beyond that to his eternal reward, and he therefore chose accordingly. He saw God's faithfulness, and it was eternity that was going to guide his choices, and then he was used very mightily of God. The author brings this home to you and to me by mentioning Christ. Moses not only identified with his people, but he identified with Christ, and therefore so are we. But you say, how could Moses have identified with Christ when he really didn't have a clear picture of who the Messiah was going to be? Very simply, Christ was the promised one. He was the Messiah. He was the seed of Abraham. And in the New Testament, he has always been with his people, always. He is in them because they're going to bring Messiah into the world, but they were also in him. They were the embodiment, if you will, of Christ. And so, always being present, Moses didn't just identify with the fellow Israelites. He identified with Christ and the reproach that Christ received while ministering. And that's the author's way of bringing it home to you and to me. Will we keep our eyes on our eternal reward and choose accordingly, or will we live short-sightedly and choose the world? Will we choose those things which are eternal in nature, or those things which are temporal? You say, well, Lair, wouldn't it be nice if God just took us to heaven for a little bit so we could see what heaven's going to be like? Then I think it'd be a lot easier to keep my eyes on heaven. It's just not going to happen, I don't think, okay? I think Paul went to the third heaven or something of the sort, but it's just not going to happen. So we have to do it by faith. Third thing, faith clings to the God of the impossible. That's verse 27. Moses therefore left Egypt, trusting in the unseen God who would be his guide and protector. F.F. Bruce put it this way: Moses paid more attention to the invisible King of Kings than the king of Egypt. So which departure was this? Because he left and went to Midian and stayed out there for 40 years, got his call, and then, went to Egypt, and he left with the children of Israel under the Exodus. Well, if it was Midian, and commentators differ, Stephen says in Acts chapter 7 that Moses was afraid because word had gotten out that he had killed an Egyptian. But in our text it says he didn't fear the king at all, or his wrath. So, you got to kind of reconcile those things. What was his faith then? Well, when he killed the Egyptian, he may have started then and there a slave revolt, but he chose not to, and he had to wait 40 more years. So his time had not come, and by faith he left and he waited, and it might have been the harder path to take. but God would care for them. Now, if this refers to the Exodus, and that's what I prefer, then everything's pretty easy. Moses had conquered the gods of Egypt, and he was told by Pharaoh to leave. Either way, Moses had to trust in the unseen God. That's the principle. And it takes us back to the definition in verse 1 of what faith is. It's the conviction of things not seen. So the question set before us is, do we really believe in a God who is infinite in all his ways, and is going to guide and protect us throughout our life? How much of life is really an exercise of faith? It's the nature of the beast, and we're all guilty. How do we really trust in someone we can't see? Except for those who have that spiritual gift called faith, and they're pretty outstanding people. We craft our lives so that we have to trust very little. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised if God tests us with something huge, and then he just drops it into our laps, because he reduces us in those times to prayer. You think of Moses and the people. In front of them is the Red Sea. And God, by the way, led them that way. Why did he do that? But he led them to the Red Sea. Pharaoh's armies are coming in from behind, and it's impossible. What's going to happen? And anyway, God takes his position between the people of Israel. Here's the Red Sea, here's the people of Israel, and the Egyptians. God takes his place between Israel and the Egyptians. And we hear Moses' famous words, "Do not fear, stand by and see the salvation of the Lord." And I can just see Charlton Heston doing that. If you've ever seen the Bible, man, he played Moses well. And you know the rest of the story. So those are places God brings us to in order that we grow in the conviction of things not seen. Fourthly, faith fears and worships God. By the way, by faith is mentioned 4 times, and so that's how I molded the outline. Faith fears and worships God. Moses, along with Israel, observed the Passover, it says. And if you're unfamiliar with the Passover, it's the last plague, and that was death of the firstborn in the land of Egypt. So the death angel was told that it would be coming by, it would take the firstborn of every house, unless the Passover was followed. They would slay a lamb, and then they would take the blood and they would splash it, if you will, on the doorway of the house. So when the death angel came by, you'd see the blood, the house is covered under the blood, and the firstborn would be saved. And they did that. But the word kept also means that he instituted the Passover. They didn't stop taking the Passover. It's perfect tense. It has ongoing observation, if you will, or ramifications. Each year, Israel was to celebrate Passover. What's the word fear mean? Well, I guess in one sense it means to acknowledge God in all our ways. But I think it also means to take him seriously. The night of the Passover, Israel took God seriously, and they were preserved, and they were to forever take God seriously. How do we worship God? Well, in the way we live. You go back to Genesis. And Adam was to till or work the land. And the word actually implies worship. That in his work, he was worshiping God. So we worship God as we walk with him by faith. We worship God in our private lives. And we worship corporately. The community is always implied, Old Testament, New Testament, that we gather together for corporate worship. And we worship by faith, as they did the Passover. In the way we live, because by faith we believe that God is right. We follow him and accept whatever happens in life because of our obedience. We worship individually by faith. We were talking about quiet time in our small group this past Thursday. And I said, is there any commandment in the Bible that thou shalt have a quiet time? There isn't, is there? There's good illustrations of it, where we need to spend time with God. We know for sure we need to cultivate our relationship with God. We have to do that, or we will, die spiritually. And sometimes when you try to have a quiet time, it's like pulling teeth, and sometimes things just flow. Sometimes you sit there with your eyes open, staring at the floor, and 2 minutes are passed, and you've prayed a few things, and other times you can stay there for a half hour if you got the time. Sometimes you feel like it, and sometimes you don't. But you believe that it is essential to our relationship with God and our own well-being. So we do it. We do it by faith. It's a good habit to build into one's life. What about corporate worship? Well, we do that too, whether we feel like it or not. I don't always feel like it, and neither do you, but we do it. We believe that God will be pleased in our worship and that we will find our pleasure in pleasing Him. We worship knowing that it makes God glad and that we will be glad in the end. Monday, Thursdays, I admitted to the people that night, there are always a dark day for me. And I've always tried to figure out why is it such a dark day? I mean, you can look at the last Monday, Thursday and go, it was a dark day. It was a horrible day, with the weather and so forth. That's enough to make you depressed. But no, it's the subject matter. It's a subject matter. The death of Christ is not a happy occasion. It just isn't. So we wear black and so forth. And we sing songs about the death of Christ. But even though I have this dread hanging over me, of course, I don't have much choice. I'm the pastor. I have to show up. But let's just say I didn't have to. I probably would. Only because I'd go by faith, believing that in the end I would be encouraged and personally fulfilled. By the time you go through all these examples in this chapter and you see the many facets of faith, you get the idea that the totality of our lives is a matter of faith. We do everything by faith. From the moment you wake up to the time you go to sleep, you live by faith. And sometimes when we go to sleep, we have to trust the Lord for sleep. I fight that. So I pray when I go to bed that God will let me sleep. But that's it. Over time, every step we take is by faith and dependence upon God. What does Romans 1:17 say? For the righteous man will live by faith.